Here's another one. If we look at 43 milligrams, anadrol is less than 50% as anabolic as NPP. So NPP then at 43 milligrams is pretty much peaking out, right? So this nandrolone's kicking butt at 43 milligrams a day.
Yeah.
Whereas anadrol back over here is less than 50%. What we see here is that for the different drugs, there are different dose response curves.
Yeah.
And especially at the lower doses, there's some substantial differences in the anabolic growth effects of these different drugs.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to Muscle Minds with Scott Stevenson. I'm Scott McNally, and all of our programming is brought to you by you, the people of Patreon. Thank you guys for supporting our programming. We do have a couple Patreon questions, but we have a special presentation that Scott's put together today, so we're going to get back to those questions in future episodes. We're also brought to you by TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK for additional savings. High quality, third-party tested supplements from a company that you can trust. And hey, if you're from Canada, supplementsource.ca. They've got great deals that change week to week. Scott, I'm excited for this topic. You've been putting this together now for like the past 6 weeks. We get asked often the question, it's a popular topic right now, that are all anabolic steroids created equal? And so this is going to be officially a deep dive. And I think that's the way this has to be, because really this isn't a simple topic, is it? This isn't something we can just answer in 2 words. Am I right?
I think for most people, you can just make it simple and just believe what you like, but I dig into that in the presentation. But yeah, when we take it apart and analyze the bits and pieces, it's pretty complex, but hopefully I bring it back at the very end to the simplest way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to try to do,
you'll get a resolution.
And I'll try to put timestamps in, guys. Some of it will be more dense, but I guarantee you that if you hang through, that you're going to learn something out of this, no matter what level you're at.
That's the idea. Okay. So fancy title, the anabolic equivalency of anabolic androgenic steroids, hereby shortened to AAS, a pharmacogenomic, mechanistic, and empirical inquiry. So kind of looking at this from different angles. I'm not a steroid expert by any means. If you're doing bodybuilding in the enhanced world, you have to come to know some things. But I wanted to kind of ask this question. These are the things at the level at which I can understand these things that I thought made sense to try to address this question. And what is it exactly? The idea is that are all anabolic steroids equally quote-unquote anabolic? Are the result in some anabolic and anti-catabolic actions resulting in muscle growth, muscle protein accretion, hypertrophy, etc., in conjunction with resistance training, essentially equivalent for all anabolic steroids? Example, would 50 milligrams of anadrol a day, 350 a week, and 350 milligrams of Deca per week yield equivalent gains? Just sort of a more basic idea. So we've got different versions of this question. So depending on what you're really talking about, you could come up with different answers. One, is this true just for a certain subset of anabolic steroids, like the commonly used anabolic steroids, not the exotic ones that might be hard to obtain, the holy grail, for instance? Are we talking about just those that have been approved for human use or previously tested in the scientific literature for humans? Test, nandrolone, anadrol, anavar, etc. Is this true only at low doses? Or maybe this is true only at maximal doses. So if you go to 3 grams a week, maybe it doesn't make a difference what you're using, right?
Yeah.
Or if you're at lower doses, maybe some have a different dose response curve. We'll talk about this because I think this is important to teasing out the intricacies of this. Maybe at low doses it matters what you might use. Is this true over short periods of time? So maybe you could get away with 400, 500 milligrams of an oral for 4 or 6 weeks, but 12 weeks in, So you might have an accumulation of toxicity. I'm going to repeat these same things over again because I like to teach that way. I think it's helpful. If someone comes out of this with 2 or 3 things they remember, that's good. It may be something I would say 5 or 6 times. Is this true on average? This is an important way to ask this, important way to think about this question. Is this true on average for most folks? Are we talking about group values as in a scientific study, right? Or are we talking about the individual level, which is what most coaches and individuals are thinking of this? It's like, well, yeah, on average, this drug is equivalent to that drug, but I have a better response to this drug versus that drug. So we have to consider the idea of biological individuality here. And there could be some combination of, like, is this true for individuals using a certain subset of drugs, right? So this can become a very complicated. I think that I switched from.
Yes.
There you go. All right. I just had to move. There's a little eCam bar that I want to move out of the way. A little menu bar.
Yeah.
The most robust version of this, is this true at the individual and group level, i.e. for all individuals, that all anabolic steroids are equally anabolic in terms of muscle growth? So that would be the most, okay, they're all absolutely the same. That would be the strongest statement that you could come up with in answering this question. And this would basically presume that biological individuality is really not apparent. It doesn't make a difference. We're all the same. So why would I ask this question? I mentioned this before. I get asked this a good bit. There's one study, Boris et al., which we'll get into, a study with rats where they use the Hirschberger assay to look at levator ani muscle growth. So this is where that anabolic androgenic ratio thing comes from. We've got these old school in the trenches bro science ideas. You get this famous quote from Dan Duchesne from his Dirty Dieting newsletter: if you can't grow on Deca and D-ball, you can't grow on anything, right? So that sort of relates to this question. We got this idea of stacking drugs. This has been around forever. It creates some synergy. 500 milligrams of two drugs might be better. So 500 plus 500 might be better than 1,000 milligrams of a single drug, right? Decades of experience, thousands of users produce varying opinions and approaches. You go on the message boards since the beginning of message board time, and you'll see all sorts of different contentions. This drug sucks. This drug's the best thing since sliced bread. We do have different drug mechanisms and actions. So androgen binding, receptor binding is what Bill Roberts, people probably don't remember who he is unless they've been around for a while like you and I, Scott. He sort of divided drugs into class 1 and class 2 based on whether they bind the androgen receptor tightly in the studies or not. There's going to be a varying extent of neurological effects too. So if you take, a lot of people take orals that increase aggression, that can impact how hard you train and then have an effect on anabolism. There's also drug-specific side effect avoidance. So this would be the idea of taking lower doses of each drug to avoid the drug-specific side effects and get some synergy from stacking that way. So we got all these perpetuated notions and paradigms. Test is best, right? That's a good one. It rhymes.
Yeah.
Trenbolone is the strongest, any milligram per milligram ever. The idea of using a test base doesn't always, a lot of guys from the Middle East, from what I understand, who would do like at the World Amateurs, those guys don't use any test, right? Right. At least when they're dieting down. You might try to control estradiol. E2 is estradiol with Primo or Masteron. Adding in secondary amino acids, adding in orals, like all sorts of ways these things can happen. And also the idea is like, you're just going to have to use empirical trial and error. You have to find out what works best for you over the course of many years, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And I'll note here, in case I forget, you probably remember that people can probably find this podcast we did maybe 3 years ago with Latz from LATS, from Professional Muscle, and he talked about a guy, I think he was Russian, maybe Ukrainian, who he spoke with.
Russian, yeah.
He was Russian, yeah. And he went and he tried numerous drugs and sort of got to his unacceptable side effect threshold with each of those. Figured that out as the first step, and then he figured out which combination seemed to match for him personally. And then he would just go with, I think he had maybe 3 different combinations that he used, and he would cycle through those. And that was it took him like years and years to figure that out, right? So that was a very systematic way of going about it. So he would never combine certain drugs because he knows that in certain doses that the side effects will be too much or they just don't synergize. So it's the dose that prevents at a low enough dose where you don't have the side effects, and then the right combination, those 2 variables, and then their interaction, that gave him particular stacks that he followed and used. So the other question is, like, is this simply a reaction or a solution or an oversimplification, asking this question to this continuous quest to find the best steroid, which will always be out there? Like, what's the best one, right? That's the question. Like, this is like, we want to try Ment, we want to try Trestolone, we try all these, potentially harsh drugs, Superdrol, what have you. Like, maybe this is just like, you guys are just wasting your time, right? Just make it simple. They're all kind of the same. And maybe that's where partial this comes from. And there's something to say for that, right?
Yeah,
you can go
yeah, there is.
with being, just being silly. So it's a comforting thing to say, yeah, they're just all the same. And because people like, black and white answers. So there's something to say for that. That's why this might resonate with us and become such a valid question, or such an oft asked question. And maybe there's so many other factors that are more important that it does kind of come out in the wash, right? For some people, maybe for some individuals, it doesn't matter so much. So some thoughts I have on that are the final muscle mass or size that you would gain over time may be just more a matter of your total dose in the big picture than some secret combination of AAS, of steroids. So if you're using 2 grams versus 700 milligrams a week, that maybe is the most important factor for many people. And so there's an analogy between with those who train as naturals. Many people, sort of your lay person, your lifestyle client, let's say, will kind of gravitate in the long haul to their comfortable diet and training regime. And the specifics of the diet and the training may not matter so much in the long haul. It's what they just end up doing. They'll stick to something that's sustainable for them. And whether there's some better approach in terms of diet or training for them, it doesn't really matter. So there's that kind of a potential, some people are just not going to be able to find certain drugs, or just don't want to use certain drugs, and it can be very much side effect related. So for them, it really doesn't matter. So maybe that's where this question comes from. It's just like, find the ones that work for you. And, they're all equally anabolic within those ones that you can use. So that's kind of the subset aspect or variation on this question. So let's look at the question more directly. Is it likely that all anabolic steroids are equally anabolic on a milligram per milligram basis? And this is really a question of pharmacogenomics. So this is the study of, and this has been around for decades now, the study of genetic contribution to the variable responsiveness of drugs. This is very important from a practical perspective for prescribing drugs. So we've got also what's called combinatorial pharmacogenetics. So this is the idea that combination of genes can better explain variability in drug action. So if we know a person's genome, and this is sort of the medicine of the future that's now become the medicine today, if we know someone's genetics, we can figure out what drugs they might better choose from. So this can get really complicated. So here's a figure. I sent you this before. I can't remember if we actually did this talk or not, but this is a figure showing metabolism of tamoxifen, which many people out there probably know. And these are all, this is a metabolite schematic. And all those, the purple boxes are, the central layer is tamoxifen. So this is tamoxifen. And here are all the potential metabolites that can be formed. And all these blue circles are the P450 enzymes that could potentially metabolize. And this one P450, CYP2D6, which is in a variety of these pathways along the way, has over 100 polymorphisms. So that creates this complex schematic. There's 100 versions of this, at least, just considering one of those P450 enzymes in the liver that metabolizes just tamoxifen. It's like, okay, so does that matter? Well, actually, this is an older study. It's from 1999, I think. I'm sorry that got cut off a little bit, but I'm sorry that stayed. But this is individuals pre-tamoxifen. Whoops. Pre-tamoxifen. Oh, that's just silly. It wants to take the pre-tamoxifen versus during tamoxifen. And in terms of their estradiol levels, this isn't necessarily estrogen action, but this is just estradiol levels because of the complex metabolism. And some of those metabolites become involved with estrogen production itself. And some individuals can actually get an elevation in estradiol when using tamoxifen, but not all of them. Yeah, so there's
Looks
some
like a lot
crazy,
of them did.
in this particular study, yeah. I mean, I don't know what the N is at the bottom here. The bottom, You see a lot of individuals who are overlapping, basically. So I don't know
Yeah.
but there's a substantial number of individuals here who started off with high estrogen and it increased, and there's some who had low estrogen and it went pretty dang high.
Yeah.
So that's an example. This shows variations in COX-1 and COX-2 activity
Okay.
and SNPs here, which are noted single nucleotide polymorphisms here interact with how prescribed doses and particular NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, actually have their effects. A complex figure, no need to go into that, but the idea here is these are examples of combinatorial pharmacogenetics. So I'm bringing this up because the question is, if we presume that all anabolic steroids are equally anabolic and somehow equivalent, then the idea is that all these things come out as a wash. It doesn't really make a difference in the case of the class of drugs, anabolic androgenic steroids, that we're talking about. The question is, well, how likely is that? We don't have the studies, and that's the unfortunate thing. We don't have the studies looking directly to make comparisons like we do for some of these other drugs. But we do know that the anabolic action of anabolic steroids is a result of the pharmacokinetics, so how the body metabolizes the drug, liver metabolism, and the pharmacodynamics, so how the drug itself affects the body. And I've got another big figure coming soon. I'm going to move through that. There's a massive number of genetic differences. We're talking here about combinatorial pharmacogenetics relating to anabolic steroids. So again, the question, would we expect that their anabolic effect is equivalent? And there's two ways to ask this question, broadly speaking. On the average in a population, all effects end up summing out to be the same, so the population being bodybuilders, or for an individual, despite this wide range of genetic diversity. So our mediating factors, the drug differences, what the body does to the drug. We've got comparisons, injection versus oral, metabolites that are produced, the innate toxicity, obviously being higher with orals, generally speaking, binding to serum hormone binding globulin and albumin, 5-alpha reductase activity, aromatization, effects on the gut or appetite. Can you get away with lots of Anadrol, for instance, if it's just going to blow up your appetite and you can't gain?
Right.
So it does, in the end all be all, does that mean it's this anabolic? Well, if you could somehow get the food in and digest it properly, maybe. And then the pharmacodynamics. What receptors are bound? We got the androgen receptor, lest we forget the glucocorticoid receptor, the mineralocorticoid receptor, the progesterone receptor, and the estrogen receptor, of course. And there's two different types of androgen receptors, at least. There's a membrane-bound, non-genomic, and then the classical genomic androgen receptor. When we got effects of the drugs on the body, water retentions, gut appetite, neuropsychological effects, training effects. Do you feel like crap, so you don't want to train? Or do you feel aggressive and feel phenomenal, so you go after it in training? So these person differences, we got this biological individuality that I'm not going to draw, but that plot up there, it just shows it's a normal distribution for testosterone levels in men. That's a typical normal distribution. Right. So this when you get those ranges back, if someone does a total testosterone blood test, those ranges are at the ends of this distribution. It's huge. So we've already got that in place when it comes to androgens and androgen metabolism. It's a biological phenomenon. It's basically in human biology, and this is at the root of why we use the inferential statistics that are at play, that we have this normal distribution, this Gaussian distribution, as in that plot up in the right there. So there's going to be outliers. If there are outliers, then the answer to the question is no, there's outliers, and you would expect that. It pretty much is an assumption of pretty much everything in every research inquiry in the biological domain. So some examples here. There's differences in hepatic P450 enzymes. P450 enzymes we talked about in the context with tamoxifen before. There's also a PDE7B isoform that's in the liver. That's involved with cleaving the fatty acid, for instance, in testosterone enanthate away. That will result in about 60%, depending on which isoform you have, just from one study that I know of, a 60% difference in the area under the curve, or basically the bioavailability of something like Deca or testosterone enanthate. There's differences in the liver phase 2 glucuronidation, so that's involved with conjugating a metabolite produced by the liver so that it can be more easily lost in the urine or cleared from the body. Right. Body fat levels play a difference as well in how all these things work.
We get asked about that a lot, actually, how body fat levels affect the way steroids affect our bodies.
Aromatase levels. Aromatase is found in adipose, for instance. So that's why people, if they're leaner, they might be able to get away with an aromatizing steroid much more easily than when they're at a higher body fat level. Something to watch out for in the off season too. I mean, like something you may have seen, someone starts to get more body fat, like, forget, I'm bulking. Yeah. And they're getting a lot of water retention, which comes from bulking. And they're also getting lots of estrogen. And when they diet down, they're like, what the heck? I got a little bit of gyno. I had no clue because they couldn't see it. Yeah. And it was sort of under the radar, right? Other things, all these things I'm mentioning here in these last two sub-bullet points are things where we know there are biological differences. The androgen receptor isoforms, there's a multitude of those based on, for instance, there's two places in particular, but we know, for instance, that one place there's CAG repeats in the code for this. It's a glutamine, the code's for glutamine amino acid. I think can range from like 8 to like 28 or something like that. Changes the shape of the androgen receptor. And that's been, for instance, associated with risk for prostate cancer. Because that will dictate to some degree to what extent something is androgenic, or like when DHT binds to the androgen receptor. There's 5-alpha reductase polymorphisms. There's variance in the SHBG, so how much of a hormone is free versus bound is going to vary. And we've got placebo effects. And that's going to be a function of both your environment and your genetic interaction. So, I mean, take a practical example here. You go to a gym where everyone's highly motivated and every other guy is geared out of his gills, and the guys you're training with are all geared up. You're going to do that, and you're going to have a different perspective on that, right? Or take another scenario. You buy from the guy at your gym, in the parking lot. He gives you some shit out of his trunk, and he's a big dude. You're like, this has got to be legit. We talked about placebo effects. You're going to have a huge placebo effect potentially if you're someone who is predisposed to placebo effects. And there's at least 28 different genes last time I looked that predispose one more so to having placebo effect versus not having one. So that plays a huge role too. And I'm a more practical example, if you take a steroid that you feel more because of side effects, cognitive effects, or you see the water retention, that could elicit then that placebo effect that affects how you go about things, and the classic placebo effect, where they quote unquote gave their subjects devolved down at University of Massachusetts, and their rate of gains just took off like 3 times faster, at least in terms of strength levels, when they thought they were getting D-ball, which was just a sugar pill, but they believed it. So there was a placebo effect. So, and of course, other things too, in terms of just looking at this inquiry, use history. So whether or not a drug is going to be equally anabolic or more anabolic could be what order of operations. If you got more from your first, we've got this idea of diminishing returns. So that first cycle might be the best cycle. Not always, though. It can be later on you have a best cycle. Yeah. Your current and previous training status. Are you coming off from a layoff? It's like, I regained a bunch of muscle and I was on, and like that was whatever I used that time was great. So
one of the common questions we get asked by you guys is, what would you do differently with your bodybuilding if you could go back in time? given all the experience and education I have today, there's a number of things that I would have done differently. One of them is that I would have started using collagen sooner. Collagen is one of the few supplements that will actually rebuild connective tissue. It took me tearing my supraspinatus in 2021 to get with the program. I use True Nutrition's hydrolyzed beef collagen. I get the unflavored version. I pay for it myself just like you guys do. I use 20 grams a day, mix it into my coffee. It's totally unflavored. You don't even taste it. Plus, I use 10 grams of their micronized creatine. Creatine has been shown to improve brain health, especially for the aging brain. I need that. And of course, we've always known about the muscle building effects. So this is my morning routine every day, and I'm encouraging you guys to do the same. Use our code THINK for savings. Plus, it's the only way for them to know that this advertising is being heard. Otherwise, they just think you're some random dude that clicked on an ad.
Ain't nothing to it but to do it.
There's a multitude of things, and here's another way to look at it. I'll move through this more quickly, but this is kind of fun. So we got these pharmacokinetics, what the body does to the drug, pharmacodynamics. There's also the non-androgenic actions, and all these are leading then to anabolism in the end all. And the things that they're gonna pop up here in the white boxes with black writing are factors that vary by drug and or individual. So these are things that are subject to this combinatorial pharmacogenetic idea. Time on cycle, oral versus injectable. The injection concentration, injection site, ester length, and volume. There's a study we've talked about here with nandrolone where they compared NPP with Deca in the glute versus the delt. And we saw there's differences there. You probably remember that one. It's a well-known study. Yeah. How much liver stress you have in the phase 2 glucuronidation, which I mentioned before. That's going to affect all sorts of things. So this liver PDE 7B enzyme, aromatization, that's going to affect the degree to which the estrogen receptor is activated. That's going to have an effect then on water retention, which is going to affect anabolic properties potentially, and thus anabolism. We've got 5-alpha reductase activity. That's going to affect androgenic properties. And in the pharmacodynamics, we've got the androgen receptor binding androgen receptor gene transactivation. So some androgens don't bind the androgen receptor, but they turn on the androgen receptor genes. Those would be the orals. And those things affect, and here we've got MPS. I think I can write on this one. It's okay now. We've got muscle protein synthesis, muscle protein breakdown, effects on satellite cells. All these things are going to interact with the person's proclivity to have those. Those are all genetically different amongst individuals. That's going to affect then hypertrophy and catabolic properties, which goes into the overall addition or subtraction of whether we have an anabolic effect or to what extent we do. The liver stress will affect IGF-1, and that'll affect appetite, how much you eat, the anabolic effects of IGF-1, it's a whole other, we talked about that here as well. And there's a nice article on John Meadows' site that I put together if people want to have a 90-minute look into IGF-1. And so we got central placebo effects, right? So that's gonna affect potentially everything to some degree, but training stimulus, hypertrophy, and then anabolic properties. So these things are all, here come all the androgenic properties, right? I feel like an animal, I'm pissed off, I train harder. That's going to affect your central nervous system, placebo effects. Estrogen will do the same thing. If your sex drive is low because your estrogen's too low or too high, that's going to affect how well you feel about yourself. Your self-esteem levels, how hard you train, right? I feel great. My lady's happy or my man's happy or whatever it is. I'm going to town. I feel like I'm an animal. I'm a winner on all in the bedroom and in the gym. So I train harder. Yeah. Progestogenic activity can have an effect there and thus affect anabolism or directly as well, of course. And we've got effects on glucocorticoid and mineralocorticoid activity, which can have central effects, potentially direct effects or anti-catabolic effects. So there's some other things that are popping up in them. And I didn't even draw all the arrows in. It becomes a very interwoven network. And we've got other variable interacting effects that seem to be genetically determined or variable that dictate the extent to which someone responds to resistance training, how much muscle growth they get. MicroRNAs, that's a whole other story. The other side of the turning on protein synthesis and anabolism is the extent to which someone has a proclivity for muscle damage. And the genes for actinin 3, that's That's a protein found in the Z line, so it's involved with sarcomere integrity, tumor necrosis factor, interleukin-6, IGF-2. There are single nucleotide polymorphisms there that are involved with how much muscle damage someone has. So if they've got more muscle damage, more muscle breakdown because of their genetic proclivity for that, that's going to affect the catabolism, how often they can train, how much anabolism they can affect with their training. And there are other things beyond that. So I thought this was I'm going to sit here and just bask in what I put together. This is kind of cool, and it's not even everything, right? That's still, all this is just scratching the surface. I probably spent, 15, 20 hours on this thing. I could have spent 2,000 hours and still not covered everything.
Yeah, that's
right?
wild, man. And it sounds like such a simple question. Are all steroids the same? Are you going to get the same results from every compound? Because it's a commonly held idea now that people, I think, honestly, at the end of the day, we're bodybuilders and the majority of us aren't quite educated enough to be able to pick this thing apart like you are. So it's just commonly been accepted. You're either an old school bro science guy or you're on board with this, that all steroids are going to have the same effect.
Mm-hmm. And to wit, all of these things that are in white with black print, those are all things that are variable.
Yeah.
Those are all things that are variable amongst individuals. So those are all factors that would contribute to that normal distribution and produce. Imagine someone who has 90% of those things in their favor for whatever reason. And then they choose certain drugs that match that right. So they've optimized their drug selection and dose, and they've got good genetics. You're going to have outliers, right? I mean, we see this, just a practical way of looking at this. Obviously, we have people like Kevin Levrone, for instance, is someone people kind of know has a pretty good response to drugs, it seems like. Yeah. His off seasons when he's just playing with the band, and then 3 months, he looks like a normal guy, and 3 months later, he's placing second in the Olympia.
Yeah.
So we have a little bit of data, not a ton, unfortunately, and this isn't exhaustive. We only have so much time, but here are a couple studies. Sample studies with HIV patients. This one that just popped up here, Stora et al. From 2005. HIV patients, no training involved, 12 weeks. They compared 300 milligrams of Deca with, actually it was 18 IUs of growth hormone a day.
Wow.
Yeah, and they got some extracellular water with the growth hormones. I'm going to draw on this one here. So you can see this is the change in fat-free mass with the nandrolone in blue, growth hormone in the red. Okay. They lost some fat mass and the growth hormone, thank goodness, at 18 IUs. They had some water retention, but they got some fat-free mass. Some of that probably was water retention from the growth hormone. So a couple kilograms over, this case, 12 weeks. Here's a study with Grunfeld et al., 2006, graded doses of exandrolone, so Anavar. And here they have gains in body cell mass, which is body cell mass is basically fat-free mass minus bone. So that's the majority of what makes up the fat-free mass. And you can see over the course of these 12 weeks, didn't get much. There's the placebo, of course, and didn't get nearly as much from 20 milligrams a day as they did out of 40 milligrams a day. And it looks like they kind of had sort of a ceiling effect here. 80 milligrams a day was not better than 40 milligrams. So the 40 milligrams pretty much got them what they're going to get.
That's
again,
interesting.
Yeah, it is, right? And who knows? You can look into that in that study, but then these are averages.
Okay.
But the reason I wanted to pull this out is that we've got 300 milligrams of Deca versus 280 milligrams of Anavar a week. So that's the 40 milligrams a day.
Okay.
They both produced about 2 kilograms of fat-free mass or body cell mass over 12 weeks.
Okay.
Different studies, different individuals, right? But roughly on par. Okay. So this kind of points like, yeah, this is telling us about. There's the arrows pointing to those two. So maybe, and I mentioned the ceiling effect. But so roughly ballpark equivalent Deca versus Anavar. This is the average amongst subjects. We don't know about individual differences. So some people might have done better with one versus the other.
Okay.
But that kind of says, yeah, about the same. And of course, we'll see the same thing just by analogy if we look at training studies too. You can have different training regimens. We talked about this a lot here, that on average give you like the 2 versus 3 versus 5 times a week study, right? On average, no differences. But when they look at the individuals, there are massive differences depending on the person, whether higher volume, higher frequency was better than lower volume, lower frequency. Would not be surprised whatsoever if we saw the same kind of phenomenon here. So this is just comparing 2 studies, 2 different drugs, different individual, different subjects, slightly different characteristics of those subjects. So here's another study comparing Deca and test enanthate. This is a pretty well-known study at 2 different doses. Okay. So they had enanthate, kind of a sort of a silly. These were there's no training. These were normal individuals, healthy individuals, and they didn't really get much out of the 100 milligrams per week, which you might expect, just kind of replacing endogenous production. But they got about 2 kilograms. Lo and behold, this was only 6 weeks with the test, and they got equal gains with the Deca here, roughly, at only 100 milligrams per week, which is interesting.
Okay.
And the 300 milligrams a week seemed to produce even more gains. So this would sort of say Deca was better than test. Interestingly enough, only test increased isokinetic strength. So I put water retention here. The research doesn't suggest that Deca creates water retention per se, right?
What is isokinetic strength? Explain that to us.
Oh, that's an isokinetic test. It's a lab test. They put Cybex is probably the best known. Cybex makes gym equipment, but they have isokinetic devices. So it's a nice way to test in this case. They mentioned this in discussion. These guys didn't go out and start training in the gym. There was no training involved here. So an isokinetic, that just means that the speed, the angular velocity of the movement is the same. So you sit them down, you do a knee extension test, and it goes at 90 degrees per second. So,
yeah, okay.
Yeah, so hold on. I'm getting a notification. So that's sort of a lab-based test that wouldn't be impacted even if they were doing strength training outside. Not as much, at least, because it's not specific to they wouldn't have had access to an isokinetic tester. But it is interesting. They got strength changes there, pre versus post. They didn't do a great job statistically here. So this almost says maybe Deca is better. That's not something you typically find. So these are normal active men, 27 years old, about 85 kilograms, no training.
Okay.
This was not a significant difference statistically, right? So what that tells us is that there's so much variability, even though this number seems like it's substantially higher.
Yeah.
It was statistically not significant. And that's the standard by which we as scientists would say something is technically different. Because if there's such variable effects, if there's a mathematical difference in the averages, but they're highly variable, then that doesn't suggest that there was a systematic difference based on the treatment, so that Deca was better than test in this case. It just happened the averages were higher, but they're just widely variable.
Huh. But I'm seeing the 100, you have 100 test, and then you have 300 test, and the 300 test appears to be about the same result. Excuse me. The 300 test seems to be about the same results as the 100 nandrolone. Am I correct here? Am I reading this right?
Does.
And then the 300 nandrolone is like through the roof by comparison. So just as a layman looking at this, I would think that the nandrolone was far superior.
But the statistics didn't suggest this, right?
Okay.
Now, what this means then, from a practical standpoint, is that there is high variability. When this is sort of the way to sort of flip this on its head a little bit, that isn't often mentioned. Actually, they weren't even reporting statistical interactions for any of these sort of things, right? The statistics were pretty weak from what I read in this study. So there was no difference really in any of the treatment groups here. So you're looking at this like, okay, there was. What that means is that the results were so variable that there didn't seem to be any substantial. And this is actually, I'm glad you bring this up. There was no statistical difference. Huh. But what that likely means then is that there were some people in terms of the Deca who were up here, right? And some people in terms of the test who are way down here. Mm-hmm. So what we don't know is whether this person who was kind of a non-responder would have been a responder if they took DECA and vice versa.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what we don't know. So for some of those individuals, that may have been the case. And the difficult thing, I kind of go into this. The difficult thing is, let's say someone's, an average responder, so they're here with test, right? And then they want to switch to DECA at the same dose. We've got the law of diminishing returns applying here, right? So they go to DECA, and DECA might have put them here at a better level, but they're not going to notice some giant push from DECA because they've already got 2/3 of their gains they would have had from DECA from the test.
Okay.
So making that comparison when you're doing things sequentially is a difficult thing. So you can't say, so you might say, well, test was equivalent to DECA. I didn't get any big, it didn't like blow my socks off when I switched from test to DECA.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. But the only way to test that, and I mention this later, is someone would have to literally do something like this where they get themselves into a pretty trained state, leave everything the same, add in test, and see what happens over 12, 16 weeks. And then take everything out, restore, become untrained or detrained, and wait a year or two, and then get themselves to a trained state and then repeat the experiment. It'd be like a 3 or 4 year experiment probably.
Yeah.
And they're not going to do that. No one's going to do that.
Of course.
Right. But people, and even then you've got a muscle memory effect.
Right. I was going to say there's still something in there because you were that big before, or that strong before.
Yeah. Yeah. So you'd have to get yourself bypass that by getting yourself in this trained state, get to where you once were. So you've got some aging that's involved. It's minimal over just a few years.
There's that too.
So it becomes a very hard question to answer for an individual who's doing things sequentially over time. What you'd have to do is, and I have an experiment here I'll talk about in just a sec, so I don't want to jump too far ahead. Okay. So now we have this famous study, Bazin et al., right? Okay. This is the one that gets talked about. It's been around for forever. 600 milligrams of testing enthate a week. 10 weeks here, 28-year-olds, eugonadal untrained males. And they had 4 groups. They trained them, they gave them testosterone or a placebo, and they had training versus no trainings and combinations thereof. So they had an untrained group that got no drugs. They got a group that just got the testosterone. They had a group that trained, got no testosterone. They had a group that got testosterone while they were training. And what we see here then is fat-free mass went up. Looks like, if it's just reading this, about 6 kilograms with training. And with the drug, lo and behold, it's just about this 2 kilogram, right? Quadriceps cross-sectional area went up the greatest with training, but they actually got some growth here in this case with the test, just from taking the test. And they had the greater strength gains. You can just see this, bench press and squatting strength. So there was additive effect to the training effect of increased strength and size when you added the 600 milligrams of test. Go figure. No surprise there, right? So the super physiological testosterone, that 600 milligrams is like 5 times endogenous production. Size and strength, enhanced size and strength gains, and didn't have a measured impact on mood or behaviors. That's one thing that people mention about this study too, is that these guys didn't become aggressive assholes when they're on 600 milligrams of test. They supposedly couldn't even tell. They weren't able to distinguish, or statistically there's no difference. So and people weren't able to, if I recall correctly, I might be wrong on this, but people weren't able to distinguish what they were on, which I think is just kind of bizarre. Yeah, I hardly believe that, to be honest. Yeah. But
you'd at least go to something, man. Your libido, or come on.
So they didn't report that, and I think that would have been something to do, is kind of come clean at the end, debrief them, and or ask them that question, say, okay, this is what you're on. So you would know. I mean, you go from nothing to 600 milligrams of test, and your at least your sex drive is going to go up for most everybody. So another very interesting study. It's comparable. 600 milligrams of DECA in this case for 12 weeks. They graded it up, actually. It went for, I think, 3 weeks. They graded the DECA dose, and then for 12 weeks they trained. So it's basically the same duration, 12 weeks versus 10 weeks, 600 milligrams of DECA with and without training. These were HIV positive men, older, a little bit lighter. But what we see here is, if we're looking at, and I just had to kind of compile, these are the three measurements were pretty much that we had in both studies. And the Deca itself gave us this sort of a little bit better than 2 kilograms, but it's a 12-week study. Mm-hmm. And when you added training, you got a little bit better growth. There was a statistical effect on lean body mass and strength, but not muscle cross-section area. So we did get better lean body mass here. We did get better. In this case, bench press strength was measured in both. Obviously, you would hope, but they got some increase in bench press strength just from the Deca. And as it turned out, the quad cross-section area didn't matter.
That's crazy.
So that one didn't happen. So we've got some interesting things, but if we look at these, I'm going to go back. Look about this 6 kilogram fat-free mass number. What do we have here? About 6 kilograms, roughly. 600 milligrams versus 600 milligrams. So there's some favorable comparisons suggesting that Deca, and this is untrained, naive folks going on one steroid at a time, and we're getting roughly the same average. So this kind of points to this possibility, that at least under these circumstances, when we're asking sort of this version of the question, that Deca and test at 600 milligrams give you about the same gain. So what we don't know is the individual differences if we were to compare Deca versus test. If we could do the repeat test for an individual and see whether they respond better to one versus the other, right? Or whether they simply prefer one versus the other. Over time, it's only Deca for 600 milligrams a week. The thing, they said these individuals, did I write this in here? No. I believe this is here it is. It's just above. All the subject reported feeling better while receiving study therapy. That was a quote.
Just therapy in general?
Yeah. So they felt better, and all of them got Deca. Right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
So some of them trained, some of them didn't. That's the comparison we have for training.
Just better in general.
Just better, felt better. That was a quote I pulled from there. So none of them apparently, complained because it said all subjects. It just said subjects reported feeling better while receiving. None of them complained of Deca Dick. But let's think about Deca versus test at this dosage. Long time, like 6 months.
6 months. It's a good chunk of time.
Yeah, this was only 12 weeks, 10 weeks for the other study. 6 months, you're going to have some guys that are not going to be like being on just Deca for 6. Some people will be okay, but not everybody. So over the long haul, you might lose those gains, right? You might say, fuck it, I'm coming off. And if someone doesn't know how to do a PCT to get themselves back online, and that can take a while with Deca, maybe not the best ester choice if you're considering coming off.
Sure.
Then you've got a situation where in the long haul, the answer is no, Deca is not equivalent to test because Deca fucked me up, ruined my life, my relationship. I lost my girlfriend or what have you. And I stopped training because I felt like crap until I got myself online a year later. Whereas test was like, I just tapered the test down, put some HCG in there or what have you. And I was okay going
Easier
back
recovery.
to a TRT dose. Right.
Yeah.
So recovery differences. So here's what I mentioned. Imagine a study. This is at the very bottom. This is what would be really interesting. I don't think this is going to happen, but imagine, because we've got these 600 milligram doses where we compared 600 milligrams of test. These will be different groups, and you could add training and no training if you want to make a mega study. 600 milligrams Deca, and then what happens if we toss in like 300 milligrams of each? See if we get a stacking synergy. And then what if we did something, because we tested Anavar before. This might have to be with HIV patients. 200 of test, Deca, and Anavar each. Yeah. So it's equal total dosage. Which might do better?
Yeah.
I don't know. I could see the last version maybe being better for some people.
Yeah, right? I know my own body. I'd prefer that. If you told me to take 600 tests by itself for the next 12 weeks, I'd tell you to go fly a kite. That's all I know. Right. But, the test with some Deca, you got your test base, so to speak. Your Deca's in there, depending on how you handle that. And that Anavar dose is that's substantial. That's like a little less than 30 milligrams a day, so 25 roughly. Yeah.
That's reasonable. Would that fare better than 600 milligrams of test or 600 milligrams of Deca, given those side effects?
Yeah.
I could see how it might be better for some people.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of, really quick, you showed us that Anavar study a couple slides ago. And what was it? 40 was good. 40 was better than 20, was it? And then
Right.
80 kind of plateaued.
Looked like it, yeah.
Yeah, we got some flack because we had people telling us all you need on an episode of Drugs and Stuff. All you need is 5 milligrams of Anavar. Anything more than that is a waste. If it's pharma grade Anavar, that's all you need. So I would say, based off of that study alone, and just obviously personal experience over 20 years plus, that you can get more benefit from 40. And but there's a cost to benefit too. There's the higher you go, the more side effects you get, right? But I would say for most people, 40 is going to be pretty tolerable for it. I guess it depends on the period of time, 6 weeks, or are we talking 6 months?
That's exactly one of the points. Thank you for bringing that. That's one of the points here is tolerability is going to vary, and it's going to be a function of time.
Yeah.
So for the long term, like, you're doing 40 milligrams of Anavar all year round,
it's going to get old.
Yeah, right. And one of the things too, like something that just sort of seems like it's sort of an empirical finding, so to speak, is that one thing you see in some of the best bodybuilders, guys that are pros, is they have a good response to the drugs, of course, too, and they also have a good ability to tolerate the drugs.
Absolutely.
And that's genetically variable, right? So it's kind of like with training. When we talk with Brandon Curry about, what happens in the Middle East, is like they just run everyone through this high volume, treacherous training regime. And those who can survive and recover stay, and those who don't, they end up, going elsewhere.
Yeah.
So one feature, one aspect, and you see this amongst many pros, is that they can have a higher training stimulus or greater training dose because they have better recovery abilities. And the analogous situation here with steroids would be you can handle a heavier dose because you've got a better ability to handle the toxicity, and that could be physiologically and maybe even psychologically.
Yeah.
Right. So this is kind of interesting. So we got some ways we could say, yeah, they're equivalent. Then we could reasons like, well, it depends, which is sort of my favorite answer for most of these things. So here's the fun one.
All right.
Here's the big daddy that I've been sent numerous times, right? And I'll take some time to explain this. So this is this Boris et al. Study, and this I selected out the anabolic steroids here. Sorry, I didn't make this a little bit bigger. There's my. So what we have here is immature rat levator ani growth. So young rats. This is a 10-day study. 10 days in a rat means would be equivalent to a much longer time in a human because they have much shorter life expectancies, 2 or 3 years, depending on the rat strain. And all of these drugs were injected too. So some of these drugs, for instance, these 4, which is Anadrol, Anavar, Dianabol, and Winstrol, Winstrol being the exception. The first 3 for sure aren't typically injected. Of course, they can be.
Yeah, I've only seen injectable Avar one time in my life.
Yeah.
It's very rare. D-ball, Anadrol, a little bit more common. Winstrol, very common, right?
Mm-hmm. And for instance, the pharmacokinetics of injectable versus oral Winstrol are a little bit different. So that's something worth keeping in mind. So it's a rat study, and it's only 10 days. But what I've done here is taken the doses that were used in the study, and they're here at the bottom, and converted them using body surface area, standardized equation, that basically the relative dose would be about 15% in a human versus a rat. And so these are doses that for 100 kilogram hypothetical bodybuilder.
Okay.
So the blue is 9 milligrams a day, goes all the way up to about 429 milligrams a day for the green. So for each of these drugs, we got a series of bars, and those represent for different groups of rats, giving different drugs, all the different doses. It's a pretty massive study. The growth, this levator ani growth. So this is a muscle in the perineal area, in the taint, to use the scientific term. Okay. Basically, that's typically used in this Hirschberger's assay as representative of muscle anabolism. So this is growth in milligrams relative to 100 grams of body weight. So it's relative growth. So it's not absolute. There's nuances there, but not super important for our purposes. So the first thing to notice, let's see if this works, is that we have a dose response curve for each of these drugs. So if we look at, for instance, Anadrol here, at this low dose, this is the control group, right? And it was just one value, and I just put it in for all bars. You just have one control. You don't need to do a control for each dose because the control is no drug, no dose.
Sure.
But we got a dose response, right? Kind of sort of linear at the sort of plateauing at the top here. And then at the far end, for instance, let's look at, sorry, get this thing out of the way for myself. I got this bar in the way here still. Just a sec. Nandrolone. So now we've got Nandrolone, and this, in Nandrolone's case,
all the way at the far right.
At the far right there, I'm drawing. Can you see the drawing there?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah, so just when we get to this third dose of 43 milligrams per day, Nandrolone's pretty much topped off, right? We've got actually numerically the same numbers. Probably this, you got measurement error and those sorts of things and variability.
Okay.
Right? So this is a different dose response curve. And I purposely ordered the drugs in this way to go from what seemed to be kind of the least. I didn't do the actual mathematical averages, but if we look at the bars for the various doses for Anadrol, they're lower than the bars for Nandrolone. So Anadrol is sort of the least anabolic with this indirect measurement, or maybe direct measurement, depending on what you consider most important. And Nandrolone's the most anabolic. And Nandrolone has a pretty steep curve from a low dose to sort of a more moderate dose. So what we see here then, next, is if we compare Anadrol at 43 milligrams a day, it's less anabolic than 1/10 the dose of NPP. So if we compare right here, hold on. We compare right here, basically Zippo effect, with this very, very low dose of Nandrolone. Yeah. So 9 milligrams a day, you're getting more. You're getting, if we compare, not the one I want to compare. If we compare 43 milligrams of Anadrol, right? Yeah. It's not even mathematically as anabolic as 9 milligrams of Nandrolone.
Wow. And
with that, it's about the same.
And would that be the same then with the Anavar next to it? It looks like.
Yeah, you can make multiple comparisons. I just picked a couple out here. Okay,
gotcha. And the D-ball.
Here's another one. If we look at 43 milligrams, Anadrol is less than 50% as anabolic as NPP. So NPP then at 43 milligrams is pretty much peaking out, right? So this Nandrolone's kicking butt at 43 milligrams a day.
Yeah.
Whereas Anadrol back over here is less than 50% based on the Levator-Ani growth.
And that's how much Anadrol?
43 milligrams a day, or about 300 milligrams a week.
Okay, I have some thoughts on that, but I'm going to let you keep going here before I say anything.
I'm almost done. We can compare all these, right?
Take your time. This is fascinating.
It's really cool, I think. So, and another one that I wanted to pull out was Winnie is about 50% stronger than D-ball at the 53 milligram dose per day dose, right? So let me get my pointer back. Here's Winnie. Winnie has sort of a same dose response curve as Nandrolone. So it's doing really well at this 43 milligrams, right? And if we compare that over here with Dianabol, Winnie's about 50% stronger, right? So these comparisons, when we're looking along the dose response curve at these more moderate kind of reasonable doses, 300 milligrams a week, something like that, right. When converted from, again, we're making some leaps here. We're converting from a rat to 100 kilograms to 220-pound human, making some jumps. But what we see here is this, in this animal model, so it's not humans, is that for the different drugs, there are different dose response curves.
Yeah.
And especially at the lower doses, there's some substantial differences in the anabolic growth effects of these different drugs. Right?
Absolutely.
And so we have marketed differences at the lower doses, but less so at the higher doses. So if we look across here at the peak effects at the highest dose, so this is 430 milligrams a day. So this is like, over 3 grams a week, right?
3 grams a week for inhuman doses.
Yeah, we're talking 3 grams a week human dose.
of nandrolone phenylpropionate. Okay, I'm with you.
Of Anadrol and NPP. Like if we look at the lighter green, and we compare go all the way across, it's like, okay, we got a kind of a peak here, but there's less of a difference here. Maybe a 30% difference. I have to do the math between this max value and the max value. So that's the lowest of all the max values, and here's the highest of all the max values. It's not that big of a difference at the higher doses. Yeah. So that's a ceiling effect, basically, that's showing itself. So once you're at 3 grams, right, it doesn't really matter as long as you can handle 3 grams. And one thing that I sort of know is that I did a little animal work early on in my master's degree, and these animals are super hardy. So this body surface area equivalency, it does seem to match up. When you look at all the physiological, pharmacological factors, is a nice way to make comparisons. But these animals are hardy, man. They're really, really hardy. So I don't know, Anadrol actually isn't as toxic as people might think based on some of the studies that are out there, if you trust in their data. But 3 grams of Anadrol, for multiple weeks, that's going to eventually. So that maybe, I don't know. We don't know. The study didn't say why. We don't know what factors led to this. If this was a toxicity effect, but overall we have a different dose response. So this is a nice study because it suggests 2 dueling answers to the same question, and it depends on the dose. In these animals, when it comes to Levator ani, whether or not 2 drugs or all the drugs are considered equivalent, they're all kind of close to being equivalent at the highest doses. To some degree, but at the lower doses, when we make certain comparisons, there would be if you're a rat who's really wanting a big Levator ani, right? Then you're gonna pick certain drugs over others, and NPP would be a good choice. Winstrol would be a good choice, right? At a 43 milligram per day dose, for instance, right? That's where you're getting the most bang for your buck. You're getting the most from the least, which I'll bring up again. Okay. At those doses with those drugs, if you're a rat who wants to grow his butt muscles. Yeah. So you had something you want to interject, Scott. What was that?
Well, one thing I wanted to make sure we got to on this particular slide. Well, first of all, I love the way you've got this all color coded. Did you pick these colors out yourself, or how did that work?
No, I did this in Excel, and it automates that. Oh. You can change them all how you want, but it'll automatically.
But that's just the automatic colors. I was just curious on that because it looked like a lot of time you put into that. That was number 1. But number 2, we've talked about this a bunch of times now off the air, and one of the analogies you made that I thought was great was the car analogy, being that if you take your general commercial car, they're all kind of going to go around 120 miles an hour, right? If we take a Ford Festiva, we take my Mini Cooper, we take the neighbor's minivan, they're all probably going to go around ballpark 120 miles an hour, more or less. But the difference is in how they get there. That we're probably not all going to be driving 120 miles an hour, just like a lot of people aren't going to be. Most people, I can't think of anybody taking 3 grams of Anadrol. So the nuance is going to be my Mini, man. My Mini is not going to take out a Ford Mustang, if we get a Charger or something like that off the line. But when we start getting into that 0 to 45 and going around curves, man, that thing is a freaking blast to drive. The turbocharger is awesome in that 0 to 45 range. Right. And I thought that was a great analogy. I wanted to make sure we kind of touched on too, because that's where the nuances really seem to be is in the dose itself.
Yeah. And it's funny, I didn't even think of this at the time when we were talking about that, but I lived sort of the perfect analogy. Whenever I don't have the dogs with me, my daily driver is my electric motorcycle, which can do 0 to 60 in 3.5 or something like that, right?
It's crazy.
And it tops off, I think, at 110. It has a limiter on it, so you can't go faster than that.
Yeah.
But I can only get, at that speed, I would only get 60 miles range, right? So that's So that would be akin to you're taking something that maybe gives you good gains in the short term, like maybe an oral, let's say, but you can't. It doesn't have good longevity. It doesn't have good duration. Doesn't have a good range, right?
Yeah.
And I've got the Blitzy mobile, my RV, which I named after my dog, my pup Blitzy, who passed 1 year ago yesterday. And I mean, getting that thing up to 60 miles an hour, I take my time. I'm in no rush. It might be 20 seconds. I don't know. And it could go 100. I've never gone probably faster than 85.
Yeah.
But so they would have roughly the same max speed, but I've got a 90-gallon gas tank in there, so I can go, 500-600 miles, no problem. So different drugs, slower gains, let's say in terms of the Blitzmobile or an RV or a semi or what have you, and different range as to how long you keep with it. So that analogy does apply, to some degree.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So, okay, let's see. So what can we make of this? We're kind of getting close to the end here. It's certainly possible that any two anabolic steroids could be equivalent for a given person. Is it likely that 3 or more AAS would all be equivalent for a given person? That's a question for someone to maybe try to figure out. Once one is, quote, enhanced, this law of diminishing returns makes evaluating other steroids more difficult. We talked about that. You just can't, the bigger you get, the less what you're going to see, and you can't say one was much better than the other. You're not going to get massive newbie-like gains from adding a new drug in most cases. Under maximal dosing circumstances, at high maximal dose, could anabolic steroids be roughly equivalent? Yeah, we could have this ceiling effect that may limit maximal anabolism. Remember, this was only a 10-day study with the rats we just looked at, right? Although, on the other hand, person-specific side effects could limit the max dose. So in this case, max anabolism would not be equivalent. That might be side effects from an oral, let's say. So you just can't do 2 grams of an oral a week, right, for very long, and compare that with 2 grams of an injectable.
Yeah.
Under more reasonable or lower dosing circumstances, your dose response curves may, for some, mean that different anabolic effects at reasonable doses, like this Boris et al. Study kind of suggests. We've got individual variation, and this seems to match the empirical reports. Bros prefer certain AAS over others. Some guys like certain drugs over other drugs, right? So, if someone's using 3 grams a week, they just like drugs, or maybe they're just a little bit, they're just highly motivated. So, But for people who are trying to do this over the long haul, most people have settled on stacks or drugs that sort of work for them. And there can be various reasons why they would get better results from certain drugs than others. So stacking complicates things. I got a couple more cool little slides. Given the unique pharmacokinetics and dynamics, it seems like that stacking any 2 or more drugs with different characteristics may be more effective than the same total dose of a single drug. It's possible. This could depend on the drug stack, the individual, and the dosages. Staying below side effects of stacked drugs, for example, using lower doses of orals, avoiding polycythemia and hypertension, could allow synergism. Yes, this is basically what the bro idea of a stack is. This is the whole idea, right? This is not rocket science. So let's say we have a high side effect oral. We want to compare that with a lower side effect test. And maybe we've got a lower effective but less side effect. A lower effective side effect or lower side effect versus a more effective at higher doses type of drug, like what Primo's reputation is. This might be a drug that's better option for stacking. So we've kind of created a practical dose response curve. We got anabolism. This is equivalent to what we just saw in the Boris et al. Study. And higher dosing would be this x-axis, so side effects would limit your anabolism in the long haul. So let's say we've got, maybe this is what we see for a high toxicity oral anabolic steroid. At the low doses, so on the left, here we're seeing, pretty good dose response, and eventually toxicity takes its toll. We just can't handle it anymore because you can't spell asshole without anadrol or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And then we might compare that with something like testosterone that's maybe more potent, meaning in terms of its total response, right? And slightly more sides than some other drugs, but it takes a higher dose before you start seeing these at the end here, right? So this is what the dose response might be for something like testosterone. And then we would have, oops, my computer freeze up. There it is. Then we have something like Primo might look like for someone individual. This is just examples, right?
Right.
So it's less potent overall. That's kind of Primo has that reputation, but it's also less toxic. So you could take it out to higher doses and get your sort of max effect at a higher dose compared to something like testosterone, right? Because you could go to 1,500 milligrams of Primo and not, feel awful, and maybe use higher doses, but you eventually can have some toxicity, right? So this is how different examples and their reputations might fit into this sort of scheme of relative potency and relative side effects in a practical sense, right? So these are just possible scenarios. These aren't suggestions, right? Just want to make sure that's known to everybody. So the stacking complexity then becomes kind of fun. So we've got ideas of synergy and anabolism with stacking. I've mentioned all this before. Toxicity of section reactions. These could sum together, so the toxicity could be additive, or secondary actions could counter side effects. So you could have compounding liver stress. When you add a bunch of orals to a test, that's not a good thing. But maybe you can control estrogen actions by adding Mastron to a higher test dose. This could be helpful, right? So this is the idea of some synergy or summation with anabolism that could work in your favor or against you, depending on how clever you are with how you piece things together. We've also got the notion of mechanistic synergy, so multiple pathways of anabolism. Mentioned this before, the classical androgen receptor, membrane receptor, estrogen receptor, everything from that big diagram I had with all those factors interacting. We've got basically multiple pathways that we're attacking with the different drugs to some degree. And this is why people would add things like growth hormone and insulin, et cetera, as well, to get multiple anabolic pathways to sum with minimal side effects. So this would allow for then lower total doses, multiple pathways, and that would be better than higher doses with having redundant pathways. So using drugs that act in similar ways. So here we've got what I just showed you with these 3 example hypothetical drugs. And then let's say we were to take 3 drugs that stack well together, and we use a low dose of the first one, and we add a lower dose of the second one, and we're still doing well in terms of the slope of our dose response curve, and then we add our oral in there. Mm-hmm. So let's say those are kind of the same 3 drugs. Yep. If we look at where our single AAS or a single drug peak dose would be, so that's here, roughly here for just testosterone at this dose. That's our total dose of using just one drug. And we compare that then with the total dose of stacking 3 drugs. We got some potentially marginal, potentially substantial. Basically, we got to the same anabolic effect, but we've got a lot less dosage here, maybe a third, maybe 50% of less dose. That's basically the idea of what effective stacking could do, potentially, hypothetically. Again,
hey, I saw it in my own experience, man. My early cycles were test first D-ball and then test in D-ball and then test Deca in D-ball. And man, did that shut me down hard. I had such a hard time recovering from the Deca. So I said to myself, you know what? Screw all this stuff. I'm just going to use hormones that my body produces. I don't like using the word bioidentical because that's a type of compound specifically that it's a specific form of testosterone. But you could say bioidentical hormones. I stuck with testosterone. I said, okay, so if I ran 500 tests, 400 Deca, why don't I just run 1,000 tests? It's going to be more or less similar dose. And I'll tell you what, man, I had the worst acne in my life from that cycle. My back was terrible, and it was, it was that thought. I never had used that much test, and man, did I ever pay for it, versus an effective stack. I could say combine test and say EQ, not get that same shutdown effect, and at the same time then still be able to bump that milligram up total,
Yeah, so I didn't put the scenario where you have, this is with, being more conservative, looking for a lesser total dose and sticking, like the idea here, I kind of tried to represent this, was that the slope of, let me go backwards here. So we use a low dose of compound 1, which keeps this slope where we want it, pretty high. Low dose of compound 2, low dose of compound 3. So our slope's high when we add each of those in, and those would be things that, for instance, if it's the Primo or the Masteron, or Masteron probably is the more certain one, I think. This is just sort of empirical data, but the best one to reduce estrogenic effects, then you might use Masteron, let's say. Get some anabolism from there. Various combinations, various people, but you're using the low doses on the left side of this dose response curve, below the side effects, when you're getting the most bang for your buck, getting the most from the least.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I was trying to present there. So, move through this. I think we're at the end here. Again, just suggestions, not suggestions, just scenarios.
Right.
It's just possibilities. Like, don't do this. I'm not saying this is what you need to do. This is just educational material. So some concluding thoughts. It could be a potentially moot question. Like, is this just an academic question, theoretical question? If you're really trying to answer it, this doesn't mean that there couldn't be some utility in stacking, as we just discussed, right? It makes sense. But as far as knowing the answer, if one drug works better than the other by itself or what have you, or whatever variation of the question you're looking at, because your past cycles, we said, past cycles with current, future cycles using other AAS, this is going to blur your ability to validly make a comparison. Like I said, you'd have to do repeated tests with long breaks and detraining in between. You're not going to do that. Or maybe have twin studies, right? So you get two twins, right? And people aren't going to, those are tough to do. They've been done, but not in this context that I'm aware of. So practically speaking, most people are going to try new compounds and inch towards a personal ceiling based on their total dosage and willingness to push training and food, right? So everyone's going to have their own limit, and it's going to be dependent on what they're willing to do and how hard they're willing to push everything. You take someone who's going for broke, trains like an animal, eats like an animal, and pushes everything drug-wise, that person's going to make better gains than someone else who might have the most optimal, but they don't want any side effects. They want to notice it all, and they train like a Girl Scout or Boy Scout or a Cub Scout or whatever. Don't want to offend any groups, right? They're not training very hard, and their diet is crap. Yeah. So the personal, practically speaking, how you go about things may be much more important than whether or not this question has one particular answer or another. At the upper limit, limiting factors can be drug tolerance, your budget, and your motivation. At the lower level dosing, consistency, nutrition, training, and lifestyle might play a bigger factor, right? So you may have a lot more variability to pay based on all the other things you do. If someone's just taking in massive amounts of drugs, right, it could be an all drugs type of phenomenon. Like, this guy's so big, everything else he does is shit, but he's using 2 grams of stuff. And that might be why he's where he is. So for some people, and this is the thing, it doesn't have to be the same answer for everyone. There may be some preferred or more bang for the buck compounds for some individuals. And for others, these sort of synergistic differences may be minimal, and it may be more a matter of total dosage, right? And that's highly possible. That's what we see. I'll go back to the study 2 versus 3 versus 5 times a week per training. There was 1/3 of those individuals did better with higher volume versus lower volume. There was 1/3 of the individuals who did better the other way, and there's 1/3 of individuals where it didn't matter. So it's very possible for some people it's a matter of total dosage more than anything else.
Yeah. And
some people may get some synergy that comes, and some people may have one drug that works better than another. So there's various possible answers. So ultimately, your genetics play the greatest role, I think. Kind of a caveat to that, to some degree, is that for the most part, though, any kind of combination above about 250, 300 milligrams a week, if tolerated, will over time likely produce substantial gains over a natty condition, especially an older person. If you take someone who's 45 and you put them on 300 milligrams a test, most people are going to get something out of that.
Sure.
In most cases. So we kind of know that, right? And it could be nandrolone, as we saw, or it could be B-test. One might be preferable in terms of long term, but in the short term, you're going to see something over a natural condition. So pretty much whatever you use, and that's what we've seen in those studies that presented earlier. So the last thing I'll say is consider this. One of my favorite sayings, one of John Meadows' favorite sayings. I love to call upon John's wisdom whenever possible. Get the most from the least whenever you can. I think that's the best way to go about it if you're going to choose the enhanced route. So thanks for listening. Here's some dog pics. I always end my presentation with dog pics.
And now Jessie, the new one.
Jessie's in the middle there. Yeah, she's underneath the desk here at my feet right now.
Yeah.
Little Jessie monster. So that's it, my man.